All right. Hello, everyone. Hi, I'm Wendy from Politics and Prose. We're here with Nandita, Dinesh, and Putsata, Reang. And we're just going to give folks a few more minutes just to sign on. We've got a good crowd, but just a few minutes. So if you need to grab a drink, now is the time to do that. Okay. All right. As I said, hi, my name is Wendy Wasserman. I'm with Politics and Prose. We're delighted to be here today to welcome Nandita Dinesh and her new book just out this week, This Place, That Place. It's kind of fabulous. If you haven't gotten it, you will desperately want it by the end of this conversation. Nandita is in conversation with Putsata Reang, who also has a new book called Ma and Me, which is a delightful, and actually, I don't know if I would use the word delightful, intensively intensive description about the relationship between her and her mother. It's actually quite beautiful, and it's an ode to mother on Father's Day weekend, as it were. So Nandita and Put are going to be in conversation. What we're going to be doing is they're going to be in conversation for about, I don't know, 30, 40 minutes, maybe with some surprises in there as well. And then we're going to move to some Q&A from you all. And we'll wrap this up in about an hour. During that, I will put in links in the chat for you to buy the book, both books, both of their books, and hopefully you'll have an opportunity to do that. If you're in the DC area, we can hold them for you at the store at Politics and Prose, or we'll happily ship them to you wherever you are. So you will also be in mute. All of our people joining us today are you're automatically muted. And we ask that you put your Q&A in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, as opposed to in the chat. This way we can find them quickly and see them so we can ask. Okay, that's all the housekeeping stuff. As I said, This Place, That Place was published this week, just a few days old. Nandita is clearly a skilled linguist. She's jumping from prose to poetry, journal and jottings, dialogue and drama. She's all over the place in a wonderful way. She's a dramaturg, a novelist, a poet, a scriptwriter, a journalist, all in one. So there's something for everybody in here. She holds a PhD in drama from the University of Cape Town in South Africa, and an MA in performance studies from the Tisch School of Arts in New York University. Focused on the role that theater and writing can play during and after violent conflicts, Nandita has conducted community-based theater projects in Kashmir, India, Mexico, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Rwanda, Uganda, Kenya, and Zimbabwe. She has written multiple books about her work, and in 2017, she was awarded the Elliott Hayes Award for Outstanding Achievement in Dramaturgy by Literary Managers and Dramaturgs of the Americas. Nandita is based in San Francisco, where she's joining us from now, and this is actually her first novel. Nandita will be joined in conversation, as I said, by Putsata Reang, who is an author and a journalist, and whose writings have appeared in the New York Times and Politico, The Guardian, Ms., the Seattle Times, and among other applications. She's born in Cambodia, and raised in rural Oregon. Put has lived and worked in more than a dozen countries, including Cambodia, Afghanistan, and Thailand. She's an alum of residencies at Hedgebrook, Camille Harding Nelson, and Mineral School, and she's received fellowships from the Alicia Patterson Foundation and Jack Straw Writers Program. She continues to teach memoir writing at the University of Washington School of Professional and Continuing Education. As I said, her memoir, Ma and Me, was just released a few weeks ago. So with that, yay, super exciting. With that, I'm going to disappear and let these two wonderful ladies take it away. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Wendy. And
thanks, Wendy.
Yeah, let me also thank Politics and Prose for hosting this event with Nandita Dinesh tonight. This is going to be amazing. Welcome to all of you who are out there joining us virtually from whatever the corners of the country or even the world that you're dialing in from. I could not be more thrilled to help Nandita push her debut novel out the door. I mean, this is such a stunning debut. I couldn't hardly believe that this is Nandita's first book, actually, because it reads like somebody who has been writing novels for many, many years, and just absolutely loved it. It blew me away. It's one of these books where you leave thinking, oh my gosh, what just happened? What was that? And you're left with these deep existential questions that will not leave your mind. And you just keep turning it over and turning it over. And so, Nandita, I want to talk just a little bit about, for those who are in the audience who this is their first time, this may be their first time engaging with your book or hearing about your book. Let me just give you a quick setup, and then we're just gonna dig right in.
Perfect.
So for those of you out there, you know, this book, it is really about so many things, but you know, if we look at just at that very foundational level, it's about two people who are trying to get to a wedding. They're on opposing sides of a war that has no name. And the two main characters are somebody called a deprogrammer, who is from an occupying state called That Place. And she spends her days trying to deprogram combat soldiers to operate from a point of peace rather than a point of aggression. And then there is the protest designer, and he is from the occupied territory called This Place. Quirky guy, he prefers not to get in the middle of war protests, but he operates at a remove, and he's hoping that he can still have an impact in helping amplify people's voices. And so these two are kind of thrust together as they prepare to go to a wedding. But what happens is that on the eve of that wedding, That Place formally annexes This Place, and a curfew is set in place. And thus begins the book. There's this tension between the two protagonists, and we don't know yet if there's going to be resolution to the tension, whether their relationship could turn romantic or remain platonic. But regardless, both of them are really just trying desperately to preserve any kind of relationship at all amid very intense political polarization. So almost all of this book is dialogue, which is just, I find incredible. As somebody who loves literature, they have to learn to live together under this curfew. And a key question in This Place, That Place, revolves around this idea of occupiers of a land and those who are occupied. You know, you look at the mentality of a people who are both occupied or a people who are from an occupying state, and they're very different. And so indeed, This Place, That Place is an allegory for places and situations that have undergone or are currently undergoing militarized occupation. Did I get that right?
Absolutely. It's so lovely to hear someone who's new to the book or newer than I am describe what they see in it. Thank you. Yeah, that's a lovely synopsis.
And I have to say, you know, the themes of the messages are so deep. The layers are many here. Nandita, this book is an absolute triumph. There's so much to talk about here, but let's get down to business and dig in. And I'm eager to just go in and with my very first question.
Let's do it.
Yeah, terrific. I love the energy here. Nandita, why did you write this book? And can you just tell us a little bit about how it came to be, when and how the idea sort of formed in your mind, and when did you begin to put it down on the page?
Absolutely. So, you know, I've been working as a community theater practitioner and an educator since 2005, 2006. So for almost 2 decades now. My work started in East Africa, in northern Uganda and Rwanda. And most recently, the bulk of my work was in Kashmir, which, as many know, continues to be an area ridden with various kinds of conflicts between India, Pakistan, and in some cases by China as well. A lot of my work until This Place, That Place was focused on nonfiction. So nonfiction in various forms, be they scripts for plays that we would create and develop and perform in these contexts or about these contexts, or it took the form of academic writing. And trying to figure out, there's a particular type of theater that I like to play with that's called immersive theater, where you try to put the audience, quote unquote, actively in the world of the play itself. So those were the various thoughts and ideas that I was dealing with. And what brought me to the novel ultimately were a couple of things. The first thing was realizing that for whatever reason, academic writing was giving me a very, very small audience, a very, very small number of people to speak with who could engage with that type of writing in a way that facilitated these kinds of conversations. These conversations were few and far between. And so I started thinking about what is a form of writing that would help me reach more audiences. So that was one of the driving forces. And the second one was, as I mentioned about immersive theater, my colleagues in Kashmir and I, at the end of an 8 to 9 year long process, we created this 24-hour immersive theater experience. And what that means in reality is, as an audience member, you would come and stay in our theatrical Kashmir for 24 hours. And you would leave at the end of that one day of experiencing theatrical vignettes in different shapes and forms before you leave the next afternoon. On the second time that we staged the play, we got into trouble. And ever since, the play has been plagued by different forms of censorship. So, but it was the police, and then online, social media censorship, and festivals not being comfortable inviting a piece that talked about Kashmir. And dealing with that, I think, made me realize just how limiting nonfiction can be. And it somehow seemed that even though in our work we really tried hard to give nuanced narratives that weren't polarizing necessarily, but really tried to unearth the murkiness to war in Kashmir. But we found that whether or not we wanted that, what people saw was this group being blamed more than that group, this group not being blamed enough, that person's story being represented in a way that that group of people didn't like. And it just, often the conversations would devolve into this really polarizing sort of polemic that none of us really wanted the play to be about. And that's when I thought, you know what, I've been wanting to reach more audiences anyway. Nonfiction is getting me in trouble. Maybe I should try my hand at fiction. And that's how the idea for this place, that place was born.
What a beautiful inception and story of this book's inception. And I can't help but think, this idea of immersive theater. Well, I'll tell you, Nandita, this book is the most immersive novel I have ever experienced. Just absolutely beautiful. You said something that I want to touch on, and then I'm going to leapfrog into another question after that. But this idea that that while you were engaging in nonfiction, you were getting into trouble. Your novel has no proper names. The people are not named, the countries are not named, the war itself is not named. And to me, I felt like this was such an incredibly subversive act of art that you were engaging in, because it could be Kashmir, it could not be Kashmir, it could be Ukraine, it could not be Ukraine, it could be any scenario in which the tension and the just a very profound conflict of even naming something, calling something a war, could be considered a criminal act, as we're seeing now in Ukraine with Putin. And so I just want to talk to you a little bit about that, this idea that nothing has a name in your novel. And there's a lot of layers that I had thought about in this way, but how did you come to that place of knowing that the messages you wanted to send through this novel, or the points you wanted to get across by writing this novel, would be best served by making places and people nameless?
It was one of those moments, but it was just one of those moments where I thought about it for a long time. I thought about, should I try to invent a different world and give different names? Do I even have the skill set to do that? I knew I did not want to base it in any kind of real country, because I just felt like that would just devolve into something else. And then one day somewhere, I don't even remember how, it just came to my head, oh, why not just call it this place and that place, and universalize it in a way that forced me to ask even of myself, what were the questions that were common across the experiences that I've had in these very, very different contexts, each of which have their very specific histories, very specific natures of conflict. What happened in Northern Ireland versus Guatemala versus Rwanda versus Kashmir versus Palestine. I mean, all of these have such different contexts, and yet I could draw out themes that were similar for me. One of them being, what is the role of the outsider, right? What is the role of an outsider who has never experienced war when they're trying to engage with someone where that war is their reality? What is the power of the imagination? How does imagination function as a tool for resilience when you're dealing with all of these kinds of censorship and suppression? And it just seemed that the more I kept names out of it, the more I could talk about these larger narratives that seemed to link all of my different work. And then it was pretty sort of, that was it. That's the way it went from there, you know? In terms of the characters, I thought about it a lot because once more people are engaging with it, they've said, well, you could have left the place nameless, but you could have given them names, like you could have given them initials or something like this to help us. And that just never crossed my mind. I think that was a stylistic quality that I admired in Manuel Puig's Kiss of the Spider Woman, where he actually uses the same dialogue signifier for both characters. And you have to close read the text to actually be able to tell who's speaking what and when. And as I started playing with it, I realized that it helped add another layer, that if you don't pay too much attention to who is saying something, sometimes in this text, it's easy to believe that what she said is actually something he could also be saying, and what he said is something she could also be saying, right? And then what does that tell us about this relationship where they supposedly represent these opposing sides, and yet there's so much similarity in how they speak and what they speak about.
Yeah. Oh, it's so profound. You know, I experienced your book in exactly that way.
Cool.
There was power in that ambiguity, because there were many moments where I had to go back and read the prior page to keep track of, wait, who said what? And then I realized, oh, wait, it's almost as if at some point these two protagonists, they become one. They are indeed two separate people. And then that gets to this broader theme of borders.
Yeah.
That you play with in this book as well. But before, I feel like I'm getting ahead of myself on themes, because I want to slow down just a minute. I mean, there are so many jumping off points with your novel that I'm so excited about. And I love that how you articulated so well the idea of that came to you about and choosing whether to name or not name characters and places and whatnot. It makes perfect sense to me. And the way your intention of it definitely worked with this particular reader, and I hope it works with other readers as well. I want to slow down a little bit, because there's so many questions I want to ask you in general, and I've got some craft questions. But one of the things that I absolutely love hearing from authors, especially as you're putting your book out there into the world, there must be some parts of it that reverberate within you. I'm wondering, what is one of your favorite parts of this book?
There are so many. And I think my answer to that question would be different depending on the day that you ask me. But today, and if you're up for it, I would love for us to read that bit together.
Let's do, absolutely. I would love to do that.
And it's a section somewhere close to the middle of the book where both of them have just watched a movie together. And after the movie ends, the movie happens to be set in this place. They're talking about what are the different ways in which that movie could have ended. What could have been more liberating, more hopeful, more poignant ways for that movie to have ended. And as they ideate, as they talk about the ways the movie could have ended, they have this particular conversation. And I will be reading for the person who's from the occupying nation state, the diamond, and Put will be reading for the person from the occupied nation state.
That's right.
The square. Do you ever write stories?
Nah, I don't like writing. I find it really boring to write things down. Well, that's not entirely true. I clearly like writing things like the guide. I like writing things that texts that seek to codify something, writing that's more like research.
Really? Not fiction?
No, not fiction, not stories.
But you seem so taken with the act of storytelling.
I love stories, absolutely, just not writing them down. In a way, I kind of see designing protests as an act of storytelling, right? The whole protest is trying to tell a story. It's trying to tell the story of what's happened here from a moment in the past until that moment in time during which the protest itself is being held. It's trying to tell many stories too of each of the people in that protest, why they care and how they care, how far they're willing to go for the things that they care about, who they want to tell those stories to. So they have one audience in the soldiers and the cops or whoever are there directly, right? Then there's the audience of the press that's covering the protests and around them, the larger audiences in the outside world who might be hearing their stories. And then there are the people who need to hear the story for the change to happen, right? So the government officials who are sitting in the capital of that place, far away from here, who are the audience for the story, whether or not they choose to engage with the storytellers in any kind of way. How did I get started on all of this? Right, storytelling. I think that's why protest design speaks to me so much. Seeing the whole event as an act of storytelling, which has a range of storytellers and a range of audiences, and trying to figure out how to frame all of that with the added layer of unpredictability in the situation, because the protest ground is not the page. There's no certainty that there is space for another word, let alone another sentence.
This was what you learned in that protest psychology thingamajiggy?
Part of it, yeah. The psychology, if you will, of the event itself. So thinking about, when we say psychology, we usually think of individuals and their psyches, but what happens when you look at an entire event, like a protest, as having a psychology of its own, and an event that has layers of narratives and experiences and texts and subtexts and conscious and subconscious nuances that, if explored, can reveal so much about the people protesting and those they are protesting against. It's a beautiful idea, I think, to think of the stories that protests tell through their protesters, through the ideas that these fighters are protesting for or against, and of course, through the responses of the other side to that protest.
That's pretty fucking cool storytelling.
It's such a great section. I love this section so much because it says so much about how the protest designer came about his work. And then we later learn how the deprogrammer came about her work as well. And how do these two individuals coexist?
Yeah.
It's so beautiful. There are many, for those of you in the audience, and by the way, if you have questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat. I promise you, we will try to get to as many as we can. And I promise not to hog all of the time, even though I'm tempted to, with my questions for Nandita. There's so much here. If you like that passage, there's so many gorgeous passages like that throughout this book. The prose is just pure poetry on the page. And so let me just mosey along here. And I know I want to be mindful of the time as well. One of the things I wanted to ask is that here we have a novel where we have two protagonists trying to live together under a curfew. It made me think of two things. It made me think of, in one way, all of us have had to live under some semblance of a curfew due to the pandemic. And in no way do I mean to make a comparison to a curfew as it is associated with war. But then the other piece of that is, as we all know, with what's happening in Ukraine right now and the curfews that are happening in Ukraine. We are in the middle of experiencing at the moment, or bearing witness to, your book essentially being played out right now. I want to ask you about the timing of your book coming out. And can you tell us a little bit about the fact that, just even connected back to the fact that there are no names here. It's like you just plug in a country and a time. Like, what your thoughts are on about the timing of your book coming out right now in the current context of what we're experiencing with wars and other parts of
In
the
other
world.
places. I wish I wish it didn't continue to be relevant, right? But I wrote it before the pandemic, or I started writing it before the pandemic. Certainly not expecting that because of the pandemic, suddenly people would read it and say, there's a new way for me to connect to this. So in a way, it's actually, I think, made a condition that seemed even more opaque, what curfew feels like. It's made it a little more accessible to people. But as you rightly point out, it's a very different kind of curfew, but it's made that part seem more relevant and relatable. In terms of, the content itself, when I read about that first day when Russia invaded Ukraine, and I remember thinking, God, one more place that could be added, to the allegory. And I think most days it's hard not to get caught up in the fatalism of that, and to just think of the number of people like him and her who are in those situations and feeling the weight of those occupations. But at the same time, I think about, and this was something that I was discussing yesterday as well briefly, is that one of the stories that struck me from the initial days of the war in Ukraine, and I'm sure they're still happening now, is when they were highlighting people who were in these underground bunkers and who were singing and storytelling and basically creating these imagined worlds as a way to pass the time. And in some ways, that is just so, it's a blip, right? It's a drop in the ocean. It is such a small form of resistance. And yet, for me, it's such an important one. And it's what drew me to this work in the first place, is when I visited internally displaced people's camps in northern Uganda. And I saw that they had young people who had music, dance, and drama troupes who were performing in the camps. And I remember just looking at that and thinking, this is amazing. Not necessarily because of any big tangible impact. They're not going to stop the war. The folks singing in the basement of towns and cities in Ukraine are not stopping the fighting. And yet, what a testament to the power of imagination, that if nothing else, it can make the moment just that little bit lighter.
Absolutely. And I think as I hear you speak, Nandita, but think of the direct tie-in between the question of time and how time operates, and the issue of hope, and how much hope does one have, and how does one hold on to that hope. And time is such an incredible theme that plays out in your book in different ways. I want to ask you a little bit about that as well. And you touched on it just in your response right now, in terms of the ways that people create and use their imagination to pass the time under curfew. It's a central point of inquiry in this place, that place. And one of the beautiful lines that is in this book is there's a point at which there's some musing that happens, and this quote: "If there's anything I understand, it is how time is experienced differently. We can bend time to our will." This idea that we can bend time to our will, and time looks different in a time of war and a time of curfew versus in a time of peace. In your book, similar to what you just articulated about what's happening in Ukraine with people who are down in the tunnels and how they're passing time, in your book, and under the curfew, the protagonists and various characters, they pass the time by doing what's called glazing. Like a mother does a lot of cleaning. People create specific routines. What would you like the reader to know about this idea of time and how it functions in our relationship to it? Perhaps a way that we might reconsider what time means. Yeah,
what a wonderful question. There's so many things that I'd like to say in response to that. So this is going to be sort of a collage type answer. I think, the point, the seeds of this where I think again planted again at that IDP camp in northern Uganda, watching both the weight of time, but there's the time that comes with the certainty of, okay, at someday the curfew will be lifted, right? You don't know when, but that someday is coming. And then there's the time that I found being experienced by folks in these camps who did not have an end in sight at all, because they didn't know if ever they would leave those camps to go back to physical homes, right? So even within conflict zones, there are these layers to how intensely time is experienced based on what kind of end date is in sight or not for those particular folks. And then, fast forward 10 years and I'm in Kashmir, and I think that's when it all sort of came back, where I happened to be in Kashmir at the time of a curfew, and there was no internet, there was no telephone, there was no TV, the electricity would go on and off. And I just remember thinking, what am I supposed to do? Like, all of the things that I use to pass the time don't exist in this moment. And I tried to ask my colleagues, and I tried to sort of say, well, how do you pass the time? And I think for them, it's not even something they could articulate, because it's when that becomes your normal and someone says, how do you experience normal? It's very difficult to then break it down, right? So one of the aspects of this book, which is the guide to curfew time pass, that's what he calls it, was me trying to say, being someone who sort of likes to be methodical in how I plan my day, for instance, this is probably what I would do, is I would try to find a strategy that I could use and force myself to use each strategy for a certain small amount of time, and say, I'm going to use this strategy for 1 hour, but then I've got to break that strategy down into mini strategies that would then go into these minutes. And I think part of that is just my own idiosyncrasies of how I would try to break it down mathematically. But there's some aspects to it that I don't think I've been able to capture in the book, and that might be a challenge for another day. Is that in this same curfew that we were together with my colleagues in Kashmir, and the most fascinating thing happened, and I say fascinating with many connotations here, is that I thought, okay, here's a curfew. We have nothing to do. So let's make theater, right? So let's have these devised theater exercises that would bring us together, and let's make stuff to pass the time. And what was really striking to me was that my colleagues couldn't. It was just, one of them looked at me and said, I can't really think about that right now. And I remember thinking, but what is the alternative? We're just going to sit here and be scared and not do anything. But he was like, I just can't do anything right now. And I think that aspect of what time feels like, where you know how much of it there is, but find yourself incapable of doing anything. I don't think I've done enough justice to that in this book, partly because I don't know if I know how to conceptualize that. Because that's the sort of weight of what time means that I don't think I fully grasp.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as I hear you speak, I can't help but think of how closely time is connected to survival. Yeah. That, in terms of mental survival, at least, in the context of your book, and people who are being occupied by another state, and what does that mean, and what does that look like, and how do we survive mentally? How do we distract ourselves enough to not think about the horrible situation we are in? Right.
When simultaneously it feels like too much to do anything at all. Right. So what is that in between? What is that liminal space, right? That where you don't know where you're coming from and you don't know where you're going.
Absolutely. I find it so interesting that you have both you have been able to translate real experiences into a work of fiction, and the reflections go back and forth, I imagine, both ways, that what's fiction reflects back into reality, and what's reality reflects back into fiction. And one of the things that I find so interesting is this question of human dynamics and human relationships under curfew. And as I had mentioned earlier, this theme of borders I want to approach the idea and the theme of borders within the context of the relationship between the two protagonists, because we can look at the question of borders in different ways. There's a question of the border of a relationship and what happens when the border between a platonic relationship and a romantic relationship begins to blur. What happens when physical borders between one nation and another begin to blur? I mean, we can just I can sit here and just enumerate all of the layers and levels of the idea of border that come up in this book, which is so gorgeous. But let me just take it one piece at a time and talk about human relationship, the question of intimacy, born out of urgency. One of the questions we don't know, as I mentioned at the top of this hour, whether there's going to be resolution for these two characters or not. We know that there's a tension there that's real. And one of the questions I have is it possible to go through such an intense experience with someone and for that relationship to not become romantic in some way?
That's a great question. And I don't know. I don't know if it's possible. It's interesting, and it's the same conundrum that I think for anyone who knows Kiss of the Spider Woman, Manuel Puig's work, right? That there's two men who are imprisoned together in a cell, one of whom knows that he loves other men and one of whom believes that he can only love women. And by the end of their time together in that cell, they both love each other, right? And I wonder if you are in these situations of forced intimacy, is it only natural to try to make whatever relationship is within your radius the center of all of your different kinds of attention, right? And I don't know, it seemed for these two characters that was almost inevitable. But I would be intrigued to see what this would have felt like, for instance, if it was a grandparent and a grandchild, right? What does that relationship look like when there's forced intimacy? Or what does it look like? I mean, I'm sure you've heard as much as I have that with the pandemic type of lockdowns, there's many people who thought they were in very committed romantic partnerships who realized that maybe they weren't the right fit. And so sometimes that forced intimacy can create disjuncture as well, right? But I think there's certainly something extra that happens when you have no choice but to poke at the things that are easier to not even acknowledge when you can say, let's distract ourselves with the television or go to a restaurant or go for a walk. So I think it was inevitable for these two characters, but someday maybe, I'd love to play with writing characters where sexual tension or romantic tension is perhaps not a possibility, and see what that would look like.
Well, it was a fascinating exploration in this book in particular, because that question of, the bleeding of a platonic relationship into a romantic one, because it brings up the question of how do human needs change and adapt in these very intense environments. And perhaps there were needs that people didn't know that they have that become very clear in these kinds of moments. Yeah. And that's one of the things that the heartbreak, because there is heartbreak in this story, to me anyways, I felt the aches that the characters are trying to grasp, which is that is it possible for them to get to that place of relationship in spite of the current situation? Literally one person is from an occupying state and the other is from a state that's being occupied. And how do those two realities fit together within one relationship? Yeah.
No, and I have to say that my personal experience has suggested that those sorts of relationships cannot transcend time. And I mean that because in self-contained, there would be many instances when I was in Rwanda or in Kashmir, there were these beautiful relationships that didn't always go into romantic spheres, but there was that intensity there of this is like a soul connection with someone. And then you leave or something happens and you can leave and they can't leave. or you're creating a work together, and you make a choice that you realize, I get to make this choice because I don't have to live with this kind of fear every day, whereas the other person does, right? And I think those incidences have happened to me so many times over the years, but that it seems like there's only that far you can go in this particular power dynamic where one person has the choice to leave and one doesn't, right? And that seems to be the most fundamental aspect at play in a lot of these layers is choice.
Mm-hmm. That kind of complexity comes out so strongly in this novel, which is where it's so beautiful. I mean, it's so nuanced, and you have to be alert. This is the kind of book where like you definitely have to be alert in a great way. You don't want to be like snoozing through the pages at all, because there's just so much here that's so gorgeous and so many profound messages here. Just like, I really had to force myself to slow down, because I thought, you readers out there probably cannot see it, but I have dog-eared practically every other page of Nandita's book. And then I keep going, I've underlined so many things. There's just so much here. I want to transition a little bit into a different question, which maybe become a question of math. And, talking about two people, now we'll talk about just one, and the question of intimacy that we spoke about previously, versus now I want to go into the question of individuality. And we learned a little bit about the motivations of the protest designer and how he came about his work and what drives him. In terms of the deprogrammer and her role and her job in this book of deprogramming soldiers, first of all, I just thought that was just an absolutely incredible idea. There's this idea that if soldiers can be thought to think critically and evaluate why they battle, is that an antidote to war? In other words, is this a potential route to peace? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
It's something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about in my own work. So there was a moment in my doctoral work in Kashmir where I was like, "Ooh, what if I started working with soldiers? And what does that look like?" Right? But of course, as soon as you start going down that road, you realize that you are immediately in opposition with one of the foundational principles of military hierarchy, which is that you don't question your commanding officer. And of course, that is framed in all of these narratives of, in a time of war, we can't have someone who's sitting there questioning our orders. We just need to have someone implementing them, because we don't have time to do all of that questioning when bombs are going off. And I think I've just sort of been consumed by that question in various ways over the years, which is to say, well, isn't that premise itself problematic? Because if you have people who are in this institution because it's the intergenerational job, that's their family profession, that's the family business, is being in the military. If people who are in this because they need help with subsidizing their education, people who want to travel and have never gotten the chance to travel. And I remember, for example, a young man that I worked with in a detention center telling me once that he wanted to join the army because he knew that the kind of regimen jail gave him kept him out of trouble, and he wouldn't be able to create that regimen in civil society. So he had to join the army. And I thought that was just his way of explaining that decision just blew me away. And then it's hard not to then take that to an extra step and say, so what happens if you have an army where you are encouraged to question your superiors, where much like the kind of pedagogies of that many of us use as educators in our classrooms, where we encourage students to ask questions, to disagree with us, to co-create with us. What if armies were to look like that? And you have to wonder if every single soldier stationed in a war zone refused to fight, or if more than half of them refused to fight. How's the war gonna happen? Right. And that's sort of the thing that's a question that I continue to carry with me. And that's a question that through her, and writing this deprogramming curriculum was also an exercise to think through, what does that look like? What does it look like to deprogram someone. And in her particular case, there are layered consequences to that as well, because as soon as you start when you start moving people away from the structures that make sense to them, you're also forcing them to re-articulate their understandings of themselves. And that is a terrifying process.
It is. And I'll say once again, just in terms of the timing of your novel coming out, this idea of soldiers reprogramming or deprogramming soldiers to think differently about war and why they're doing it and how to question authority. Again, we're seeing this happening in Ukraine, where Russian soldiers are questioning why they are there. What's their purpose? Why are they killing, in another country? And, but again, it is that question of, I love the fact that it's raised in your novel, because it gets to the heart of something that I, being also from a country of war, run circles around constantly in my mind is, how do we get to a place of peace ultimately? What are the different routes and paths that we can actually get there? And so, I mean, this is just some deep thinking on that topic.
Thank you. I think Wendy coming back means it's time for us.
I have so many other questions for Nandita.
Well, I wanted to actually ask a question that came in from one of the folks who's watching tonight, and they asked, can you talk a bit about the decision to play with the literal space of where the text is laid out on the page? So for those who don't have the book, if you look through it, you can see every page is sort of formatted. You can't really see it here on the screen, but every page is sort of formatted slightly different to represent the flavor of the text. So I think it's a very astute question. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Absolutely. And thank you to the person who asked this, because it will allow me to naturally segue into thanking two audience members who were super, super helpful in this process. Mary Krinky, my amazing agent, who's in the audience today, and Aaliyah Canada, who was at Melville House and was the editor who I believe fought for the acquisition of this book by the publisher. So thank you to both of you, because you working with them really helped me nuance the approach to this use of space on the page. So initially, Wendy input, the novel was far more direct in how it talked about occupation through the visual aesthetic. There was a physical dividing line through almost all of the pages, and everything would happen either on the right or the left, and it was a very binary experience. When Mary entered the picture, we'd had conversations about how do you nuance this, right? How do you make this point you're trying to make about them being and speaking from different sides of the page on different sides of the page, but also allowing for the fact that because of their connection, this amazing connection that they share with each other, that sometimes it does feel to them like they're on the same side of the page. It does feel like they're speaking the same language. It does feel like they're completely in agreement. And at other times, it isn't. And so I will leave some of that interpretation open to the reader. But when Mary entered the conversation with me, and then Aaliyah, it was sort of thinking about, okay, so they generally started off being from opposite sides of the page, but then when certain things happen, they feel like they're on the same side. Certain other things happen, they flip back and forth. And there are rules to this and how it's happened in the book and how I've decided to place it. But it's also open to interpretation. So I dare say if Put were to go back and think about how she might want to space things out, or Wendy, if you were to go and think about, okay, with that premise in mind, how am I going to space things out? There might be sections where you completely disagree with me. And I think for me, that's one of the joys of that kind of approach, is that it also becomes a point of discussion for different types of readers to say, but no, actually right now, I think they are on the same side of the page, and it's important for them to be on the same side of the page. Why have you put them on different sides? Yes, so that was all of the thinking and the process and the teamwork, I think, that went into taking something that was in its first draft a very simplistic binary and crafting it into a more complicated, nuanced notion of borderlands, right? As put so well articulated.
Interesting. It's sort of a literal interpretation of being on the same page or not.
Yeah, or not. Exactly.
It's so beautiful, and I just want to add a couple of my 2 cents here. It's so beautiful how this book lives on the page. That's the other thing. This is the first time I have picked up a novel and have engaged with a novel that exists in this particular way that yours is. I mean, just the absolute creativity and imagination that you used in every rule that you broke in structuring a book is something that I want. If I taught fiction, I would absolutely be teaching your novel. And even though I'm not teaching fiction, I am still going to find a way to teach your novel, because we need to understand as storytellers, particularly in the literary world, effective storytelling. And so much of that has to do with structure, how a story and what kind of container a story lives in. Just gorgeous.
Oh, thank you. If it's okay, I can share my screen and sort of scroll through some of the pages so that folks who haven't read it. Cool. So a lot of the pages will look like this, like dialogue, but you will just as well find sections that look like this, that look like prose. And I'm just going to quick scroll, so you'll see grayed out boxes of text. You'll see internal monologues that happen in italics. There we go. There's one grayed out box of text.
It's amazing.
So at each page, I have to give a big shout out also to the Melville House designers. I do not think this was a very easy book to design, layout, and typeset. So that should give folks an idea who haven't had a chance to look at the book yet.
No, that's totally fascinating. I have a different type of question. This is just a personal thing. I'm one of these people who likes to read two books together in a companion space. As I'm listening to you talk about this, I'm thinking about Mohsin Hamid's East-West. But I'm also wondering if you were to recommend a companion book to be reading with this.
That's a great question. And I have an immediate answer. There's a book by a Kashmiri writer, Basharat Peer, and it's called Curfewed Night. And I would strongly suggest reading that, because while this, I think, focuses on a slightly more distanced insider-outsider dynamics kind of thing, Basharat Peer's book is a very first-person lived experience narrative of what it feels like to go through a curfew, and then that particular context in which Kashmir's curfews happened in his childhood. So I think that would be a really, really interesting read alongside this one. Great question.
You're talking about Curfewed Night by Bashar.
That's right.
Okay, I'm going to put that in the chat. And what would you recommend as a complement book to yours?
I don't know about to mine, but maybe both to mine and Nandita's. Omar El-Akkad's novel American War, that I'm not reading, but I am listening to the audiobook right now. There's so many echoes back and forth between Nandita's book and Omar El-Akkad's book. That's just, it's almost as if the books are in conversation with each other in a way. And it's kind of blowing my mind to be engaging with. Well, Nandita, I read your book before I started on Omar El-Akkad's book. And it's just, I mean, it's making me think at such a deeper level about all of these existential questions that you bring out in this place, that place. And, and I think for those of you who are out in the audience, I mean, you don't just buy a book of this, you buy like 3 or 4 of these and you pass it to your friends, because we have to have the conversations that exist within these pages. We absolutely have to have these conversations, because if we are ever going to begin to get to a place where there aren't these kinds of borders and there aren't these kinds of prohibitions and very clear delineations in our world, we have to actually just talk about some of this stuff too. And no better place to begin those conversations than to engage with this kind of text that and this kind of beautiful storytelling that Nandita has given us.
Sure. You're so good for my ego, but my head's
Nandita, I cannot say enough great things about this. You can ask my friend. My wife is like, I will not shut up about your book since I read it.
Well, it's so funny that you mentioned Omar El-Akkad, because you clearly you have some kind of ESP, because actually he's doing an event with us in an hour.
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
I had no idea.
So those who want to tune in at 8:00,
Amazing.
Part of a panel about climate fiction. So
I might have to like stay on for that.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. I'm sure that was, you just intuited it. So there you go.
Wow, that's
fantastic.
I have a last question for both of you.
Mm-hmm.
If you were not a writer and you could be anything else, and you had magical powers, you didn't have to go back to school or anything, it just magically was what it was, what would your alter ego be?
Nandita.
But I was going to punt that to you first, so I got more time to think.
I have something in mind.
Please.
Because it's just an easy answer for me. And my memoir actually, it's evoked in my memoirs. I would be a chef. I love food and I love cooking for others, and it's just a big part of my life. So that would be a super easy way out of writing for me, and has been when I want to procrastinate.
Perfect. Okay, so we're going to your house for dinner.
Exactly.
I mean, there's a cheesy part of me that wants to say that I feel like writing would still be there.
Fair
right? But I've been intrigued by cardiothoracic surgery.
Wow.
And I think
brilliant.
And I think it's because one of the questions, you do theater in war zones and you think, what is this even doing, right? You're going to a place where bombs are falling and you're saying, let's create a play together. You should be a doctor and actually helping the people on whom the bombs are falling. So I think it's just, for me, been one of the voices in my head that has said, that is the tangible way to help people. So anyway, that's probably what I do.
And the chef. Well, there you go. With that, I don't think we can top that. So.
Can I ask one last question?
Please.
Because it must be asked. This book is so dialogue driven, and the dialogue is gorgeous. It's got its own cadence. It demands to be and live and exist as an audiobook. Can we get one? Can you do that?
I will ask my people.
And if your people are out there, please put this in an audiobook, because I will buy the audiobook. I will tell everybody to buy the audiobook as well as the actual physical book.
There you go.
Thank you for being such a generous and gracious conversation partner, Put. And Wendy, thank you for hosting and for your questions as well.
It's our pleasure. And again, from Politics and Prose, we're delighted to have you. My book is backwards, but it's this place, that place. Kind of appropriate to be backwards here. So, but she's got it the right way. And again, Putsata's book is Ma and Me, also a wonderful read. So thank you both from California and from New York, coast to coast, and everyone else who joined us. Please buy the book. This is the best way you can support both the authors and your bookstore, preferably Politics and Prose, but you can buy wherever you want. And thank you again. I hope you all have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Congratulations, Nandita.
And to you.